I hope that everyone that has tuned in this afternoon will go away with today's webinar with a basic understanding of the topic and perhaps a better understanding of some of the potential challenges. As you can see on the screen, our topic today is the recently revised exceptional event rule and how those revisions might impact fires in the Great Plains. I think my talk may be particularly relevant to those of you who either are a practitioner of prescribed fire or perhaps a federal, state, or local agency that deals with areas of either wild or prescribed fire and the potential impacts the smoke produced by these fires may have on citizens' health. I'll start off today by explaining the rule with a little background information, then proceed to talk about more of the nuts and bolts or the technical aspects of the rule and the revisions that were recently implemented by EPA, and then end with some discussion about the concerns or challenges that folks might face with this rule and its revisions. I'll specifically talk about the concerns that we had as an air quality agency in Kansas with the revisions, but I think that most of these might extend as well to others across the Great Plains states. I'm hoping to keep the presentation to about 20 to 30 minutes, maybe a little longer, so that there's time at the end to answer participants' questions and or discuss other concerns that folks might have on the exceptional event rule revisions. So first, what is an exceptional event? Well, the Clean Air Act defines an exceptional event as an event that, one, affects air quality with a clear causal relationship between that specific event and the monitored exceedance of the NAAQS, or the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Number two, it's not reasonably controllable or preventable. And three, is a natural event or an event caused by human activity that is unlikely to reoccur or in a particular location. So exceptional events are unusual or naturally occurring events that can affect air quality, but are not reasonably controllable by using techniques that a tribe or a state or a local air agency might implement in order to attain or maintain the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Exceptional events might include things like wildfires, dust storms, stratospheric ozone intrusions, volcanic and seismic activities. So those are the main ones that are listed under the exceptional event rule. So a little bit of history on the rule background. On March 22nd, 2007, EPA promulgated the Treatment of Data Influenced by Exceptional Events Final Rule. We all know this rule as the Exceptional Events Rule, or the EER rule, and it superseded EPA's previous natural events guidance and interim fire policy documents. The EER basically created a regulatory process, and this process contains sections for definitions, procedural requirements, requirements for state demonstrations, and criteria for EPA approval for the exclusion of air quality data from regulatory decisions under the EER. In the EER, the original prescribed fire was mentioned specifically, but in order for prescribed fires to qualify as exceptional events, states must and had to certify to EPA that they had either a smoke management program and that it had been implemented, or that the state had or could ensure that burners employed basic smoke management practices. And then if an exceptional event occurred when using those basic smoke management practices approach, the state would have to undertake a review of that approach to ensure that public health was being protected, and then it must include considerations of further developing a smoke management plan instead of just basic smoke management practices. The revised rule was published in October of last year, And it also established procedures and criteria for identifying and evaluating air monitoring data that might be affected by exceptional events, i.e. dust storms, smoke events, wildfires. It affects the designations, redesignations, classifications, attainment demonstrations, attainment date extensions, and then finding of what is known as SIP inadequacy, which are state implementation plans that might lead EPA to do a SIP call on a state if they were not meeting those SIP requirements. And then it also applies to all state air agencies, local air agencies, and also to any tribal agencies that might be operating air monitoring equipment that produces regulatory data. Federal agencies might be included in this if they had obtained the okay from their state agency to submit exceptional event requests on behalf of the state. So that's a little bit of background on the rule and the revision itself. So why did EPA take the rule and do revisions? According to EPA, they initiated the revisions and some more guidance development process to address certain issues raised by state, local, and tribal agencies and other stakeholders since the original rule was promulgated or issued back in 2007, and also to increase the clarity and efficiency of the exceptional rule criteria and the process that states and locals had to go through in order to develop and submit an exceptional event request. So back in 2005, when Congress amended the Clean Air Act to ensure that states and localities were not considered in violation of federal air quality standards due to these naturally occurring or uncontrollable events, otherwise known as exceptional events, such as dust storms and wildfires, EPA promulgated the exceptional event rule in 2007 to address those amendments to the Clean Air Act. The problem with the original exceptional event rule back in 2007 that it proved to be broad and vague. It sapped a lot of state and local air quality resources to prove that even routine naturally occurring events were not results of man-made pollution. And it put a burden on states and local agencies with some sort of an indefinite process and a cumbersome process to try to get data flagged in order for that data to not be used against an area as to whether it was meeting or not meeting a federal air quality standard. And there was also issues among the states about the consistency among the EPA regional offices on how they dealt with the state's requests for exceptional events. So some of those are the reasons why EPA started looking at the original exceptional event rule and started thinking about revisions that they could make. So a prime example for us in the state of Kansas and our air quality agency, we submitted a exceptional event request back in 2012 for 4 days events that occurred in 2011 that involved smoke intrusion into metropolitan areas from an area in the state of Kansas called the Flint Hills. That submission, just to show some of the concerns that we had with how onerous the exceptional event rule was, it took us and our consultant hundreds of man hours were invested in developing this document. Multiple people here at KDHE, multiple staff and consultant staff were used to work on this project, this submission for this exceptional event. It took us over a year to produce the document that we thought was necessary in order to get concurrence from EPA. The document itself is 247 pages long. and a total cost of approximately $150,000 went into developing this single document for 4 days in April of 2011 to get that data flagged so that it wouldn't be used to determine whether an area was attainment or non-attainment. So you can see the concerns that a lot of states had with trying to implement that rule and produce documents that they could get the data flagged. So there was a lot of feedback from the states as we went through the process about how hard it was to use the rule in order to get that data flagged. So I think one of the good things is that EPA listened and I think learned through this process after the original rule came out in 2007 and all the discussions and consternation that the states shared with their regional office and headquarters. So EPA did quite a bit of collaboration with the states, tribes, and local agencies and other stakeholders as they began the process of looking at revising the exceptional event rule that just came out this last year. There were multiple public webinars held by EPA, listening sessions where EPA would take comments from stakeholders and states and local agencies and tribal agencies about their concerns about the original exceptional event rule. They held meetings, best practices discussions, and then they held a formal public hearing in December of 2015 to take formal public comments on revisions to the exceptional event rule. So in general, EPA did a good job of getting with the states and the local agencies to try to understand their concerns of what the exceptional event rule was and changes that might make it a better rule. So one of the things that a lot of states complained about in the original exceptional event rule and that EPA decided to remove was this idea or this concept of the Butfor requirement in the original exceptional event rule. The Clean Air Act, Section 319, directed EPA to write regulations basically specifying the criteria that must be met for monitoring air pollution data from a natural event or certain human activities to be excluded from the NAAQS designation demonstrations. The section states that there must be a clear causal relationship between the exceptional event and the monitored exceedance or violation of that NAAQS. Well, EPA addressed that directive by creating what a lot of states felt was a notorious Butfor requirement. And that requirement basically said to exclude data from attainment demonstrations or exceedances of a standard, the submitters had to demonstrate that an area that had the exceedance or was in non-attainment but would have been in attainment but for pollution from that exceptional event, they had to prove that that would not have happened except for or but for that exceptional event. Well, most air agencies found that extremely difficult to filter out the impact of any event and demonstrate with, you know, quantitative analysis how that event was the singular cause of a NAAQS exceedance, especially as you got farther and farther away from the actual event location. It became harder and harder for states to directly relate that that event to their exceedance or violation. So as a result of that, very few states made use of the exceptional event rule, even after EPA tried to supplement it with some guidance that they came out with in 2013. So EPA listened to the states and removed the Butfor requirement from the revisions, and we as a state of Kansas Air Agency thinks that was a very good step. So basically, what EPA decided to do on the revisions to the exceptional event rule was to kind of return to the core statutory elements of the original exceptional event request, and these are the three listed there. That the event affected air quality, which is kind of the basic hurdle that a state must show, is that the event affected air quality, and that is done through our monitoring networks, our air monitoring networks, and it affected air quality in such a way that there exists this clear causal relationship between that specific event or events and the monitored exceedance or violation. And then you must support that by comparing the event influence monitor data to data from that same monitor at other times. Second, the event was not reasonably controllable or preventable. And third core statutory element that was included in the revision was that the event was human activity unlikely to recur at a particular location, or that it was a natural event. Additionally, they codified some requirements for content and organization of exceptional event submittals. Some of the complaints that they heard from states was that there was some discussion about what things needed to be included in the demonstration project from the states, whether public comment process was needed or required, some definitions. There was some discussion about, well, what did this mean? What did that mean? So they codified some requirements for the content to make initial notifications by the state of a potential exceptional event, a requirement but waivable. And that's a preliminary step before submitting a demonstration. To include narrative conceptual model, to address the three core statutory elements that we just looked at on the slide before, the clear causal relationship, human activity unlikely to recur, a natural event, and it was not reasonably controllable or preventable, and to include documentation that public comment process was conducted. They also looked at specifically fire and fire-related events, and they clarified that all wildfires on what they termed wild land were natural events, or would be classified as a natural event. They clarified again that prescribed fire is a human-caused event eligible for treatment as an exceptional event, and to rely on land resource management plans for the frequency of reoccurrence or for the not reasonably preventable piece. They identified recommended components of a smoke management program, and that was in the preamble to the revised rule, and the idea of basic smoke management practices, or BSMPs, that are directly in the rule text. Also required land manager, burn managers, and air agencies to collaborate regarding the process by which the agencies work together on these BSMPs, the best smoke management practices, and the selection and application as appropriate for those two things. And they also define, like I said, fire-related terms in more regulatory language, and those were things like prescribed fire, wildfire, and wild land. So changing a little bit here into why the state of Kansas Air Quality Agency is concerned about the exceptional event rule. The state of Kansas, we have an area in the state called the Flint Hills. They're historically known as the Blue Stem Hills. It is a region in eastern Kansas, and it actually extends down into north central Oklahoma. And it was named for a lot of residual flint that was eroded from the bedrock, and it lies near the surface and so hence the name, the Flint Hills. And it stretches, like I said, from Kansas to Oklahoma, and this area basically is the last large remaining intact tallgrass prairie in North America. The graphic there shows the extent, the historical extent of the tallgrass prairie actually stretched all the way from Canada down into Texas, and then from eastern Nebraska and eastern Kansas through Iowa and Illinois and into Indiana. But of that 170 million acres of historic tallgrass prairie, less than about 4% of that remains, and that's primarily in the Flint Hills. And so that makes it one of the rarest and most endangered ecosystems actually in North America. So you can see the next slide shows some pictures of the Flint Hills. Very wildland looking. I think we meet the definition, and we had some concerns about that when the revisions came out. You can see that middle picture there. Gives you an idea of why the European settlers that first came to this area were not able to plow the Flint Hills under and grow crops because of the rocky nature of the Flint Hills, and one of the reasons why it continues to be a tallgrass prairie, and unlike a lot of the other areas in the other states that were plowable, remained unplowable and remained a tallgrass prairie. The most economical and historic way that the area maintains being a tallgrass prairie and remained a tallgrass prairie in history was the use of fire, whether that was naturally occurring fire by lightning or the Native Americans setting fire to the prairie when they noticed that the bison would go to newly burned areas where the green grass was growing quickly. And then Eastern Europeans, as we settled the Flint Hills, mimicked what the Native Americans were doing. And the other reason is to maintain the ecosystem because of where they're located, the amount of rain they get, the invasion of eastern red cedars doesn't take a whole lot of time before the landscape would change to an eastern red forest, cedar forest. And that bottom right picture shows an area that probably hasn't seen fire in 10 or 15 years, and as you can see, the eastern red cedars are pretty much taking over, and probably in about a 30-year time frame that the landscape would be a forest. Quickly, I just wanted to, we'll see if these will work. Had a couple videos that show the fire that occurs out in the Flint Hills, and we'll kind of quickly move through these. Once again, trying to remove the invasive species, eastern red cedar, and get rid of the old grass, and what may be more important is the thick litter that lays on top of the soil and reduces the effectiveness of the ecosystem by reducing light. It ties up nutrients, and it keeps the soil cool in the spring, and delays the plant growth. So as you can see, these are large fires in the Flint Hills. We're not talking about 100 to 500 acre fires. Some of these fires may be 1,000 acres, 2,000, 5,000 acres at a time. So you can imagine as you watch those videos, if you had 40, 50, 60, or 100 of these fires going on at the same time, the amount of fire and smoke that may be put into the atmosphere, and that is the reason why we have gotten involved with the Flint Hills fires and the smoke impacts that occur in downwind areas occasionally as these fires are set in the springtime. So this graphic here on this slide just gives you an idea of the amount of acres that are burned across the Flint Hills region every year. K-State began doing this analysis back in 2000, and the KDHE began or took over the analysis in the 2011-12 timeframe. As you can see, last year we burned in the Flint Hills about 2.6 to 2.7 million acres, which was a little bit above the 16 or 17 year average of about 2.2 million acres a year. So we do burn a lot of acres, and we burn them in a short time frame. Most of the fires are confined to middle March to late April every year, and then depending on weather conditions and whether they can get out and burn, that might be compressed into a handful of days. So when those conditions occur, then we have potential air quality problems downwind from these fires. You might notice 2012 and 13 kind of stick out there. The reasons why we did not have a whole lot of burning on those 2 years is that we had an extended drought across the Flint Hills, and that was the reason for the significant reduction in the number of acres over those 2 years. But on average, about 2.2 million acres burn in a very short time frame. Just quickly, the background on the burning, I mentioned some of these. The prairie is burned in March and April, and it's to preserve the ecosystem by controlling those invasive trees like the eastern red cedar, but it's also burned to improve cattle weight gain. The cows like to go to the newly burned grass as it comes up. It's more palatable, and they actually, it improves the weight gain on the cattle as they eat that new grass versus the old dry grass. Safety conditions, like I said, limit the number of days that are suitable for burning. Anybody familiar with the Central Plains in the springtime, it's either too windy, too rainy, too dry, something meteorologically is going on that doesn't allow them to burn. And like I said, burning has caused ozone and PM exceedances across not only Kansas but in downwind metropolitan areas, especially in the state of Nebraska in times past. So going on, some potential concerns that the state air agency in Kansas, when we examined the revisions to the exceptional event rule, and some of these will probably pertain to other state agencies, other agencies that might be involved in fires and smoke management in the Great Plains. It was the definition of wildland. We were concerned, well, does the Flint Hills meet that definition? If you can look at the picture down below on the left, we think it did, but we had to get assurances from EPA regionally and on the national level at headquarters that the Flint Hills would meet that definition. And I think prior exceptional event submissions from us and talk and work with EPA established that the Flint Hills are unique and a specialized ecosystem that met that definition, but others might have some issues with that, and so that's a potential concern for folks. And so prescribed fires within the Flint Hills would be eligible for exceptional events because we do meet that wildland definition. Another concern was the smoke management plan requirements. The Kansas Department of Health and Environment did develop a smoke management plan in the Flint Hills back in 2010, and the reason for that was that we submitted a exceptional event request in 2009, and EPA denied that exceptional event request, and the reason for that is because we did not have a smoke management plan. So that was an impetus for us to develop that plan for the Flint Hills, and the plan itself has 5 or 6 sections. There is an authorization to burn to minimize air pollution emissions, smoke management components of the burn plans, public education awareness, surveillance and enforcement, and program evaluation. So as that revision came out and smoke management plan requirements were still in there, we wanted to make sure that we were meeting all of those requirements again in our plan, and that we would not have to go back in and make any changes to our plan. And the two that stuck out, I think, the most was the bolded there, the authorization to burn, and the surveillance and enforcement section. So the authorization to burn is a process for authorizing, basically, and granting approval to manage prescribed fires. It does not require permits, etc. And we think that we meet that, our smoke management plan meets that authorization to burn, not so much from the state level, but through our local authorities. They ensure that safe burning conditions exist before burns, and that already multiple counties require permits that establish approval authorizations to burn across those counties in the Flint Hills. The surveillance and enforcement was procedures to ensure compliance with the smoke management plan. The Flint Hills smoke management plans has a surveillance and enforcement chapter. That enforcement is handled by local fire and emergency management, local officials, district staff, our KDHE monitoring compliance folks monitor that compliance, and we have an April burn restriction regulation in place that limits the amount of burning that goes on in the month of April outside of rangeland burning. So basically that reg eliminates any burning that doesn't involve rangeland burning in the smoke management plan counties for the month of April. And we also have air monitoring network across the state. We do remote sensing data, and we conduct surveys that evaluate the effectiveness of the plan. Other potential concerns were the unlikely to recur at a particular location. Kansas has referenced and established a natural fire return interval for our tallgrass prairie in the Flint Hills at 3 to 5 years. As we developed our smoke management plan, we talked to stakeholders, we talked to folks at Kansas State University to establish what the natural fire return interval for the tallgrass prairie was, and that was established at that 3 to 5 years. And we also, at our agency, utilize remote sensing satellite data to determine acres burned each year, and we calculate that fire return interval by doing and looking at burn scars on the prairie, on the Flint Hills, as the year progresses. This slide kind of shows that process and the graphics that we produce here at our agency. This is the view of the number of acres that were burned last year across the Flint Hills. We do this analysis by county so that we can see which counties are burning how many acres, and we can also look at, as we progress through the season, how much of that fire has occurred and where the majority of the fires occur and where the majority may not have occurred, so that we can alert our citizens when we think there might be large burn days. We can also create images like this that we can see the progression of the burn season. This is last year's burn season, kind of in an animated feature, so that we can kind of see the season progress, and as we go through that season, where the majority of the burns have occurred. This also allows us to produce graphics like this slide, where we can take all those yearly burn analysis and put them together and come up with this burn interval graphic, so that we can see that the ranching community, the folks out in the Flint Hills, are following this natural return interval in case we do have to submit an exceptional event request to EPA. And as you can see from this map, the percent of burns that are occurring every 3 to 5 years are in the 12 to 19%, 12% every 3 years, 20% every 5 years. And you might notice that throughout the Flint Hills, there's no fire in about 40% of the area that could be burned. Does not get burned or has never been burned over the 2000 to 2016 season. So this allows us to make that consideration to EPA that the ranching community is following that as nearly as possible that historical burn interval. The final, I guess, potential concern for the revision was the idea of this mitigation plan concept that was included in the revisions to the exceptional event request. And basically, the revision said that a mitigation plan may be required for an area that has 3 events, exceptional events, in a particular area at a particular monitor in 3 consecutive years. The smoke management programs might satisfy the mitigation plan requirement, but we're not positive on that. Some required components of a mitigation plan for an area that might have 3 events in 3 years is a public notification and education piece to identify, study, and implement mitigating measures for whatever the event that's affecting an area might be, and then to provide for review and evaluation of that mitigation plan as the plan goes into effect. And EPA said that they would not concur with certain exceptional event demonstrations if an air agency had not submitted that related required mitigation plan within 2 years. So basically, if an agency had to develop a mitigation plan, they were given a 2-year time frame to develop that. If an area had an exceptional event after that 2-year time frame and wanted to get that data flagged, EPA would deny that unless the mitigation plan was accepted by EPA. So we have a concern at our level, at the state of Kansas level, because we have seen some areas in the state of Kansas and in the state of Nebraska that have been affected by smoke the last couple years. I just wanted to quickly go through one of the exceedances that we saw last year to show this is an area that potentially, if we had another event this year in the city of Wichita from ozone and we wanted to develop an exceptional event request demonstration, if that event was going to cause the city of Wichita or Sedgwick County to possibly go non-attainment or not meet the air quality standards for ozone, then we possibly could have to develop this mitigation plan. So just quickly, this was an event last year that caused by burning in the Flint Hills. This was April 4th. This is a picture of downtown Wichita, and you can see the significant amount of smoke that was blown into the city of Wichita from the Flint Hills on that day. This is actually a picture that was in the Wichita Eagle newspaper. This graphic quickly shows the satellite-derived detected fires across the Flint Hills. The little red triangles are the number of fires. The grayed out areas are analysts' depiction of where the smoke plumes were. And you can see a large area of smoke over eastern Kansas and into the Wichita area. The monitoring data for the 3 monitors, ozone monitors that we have in the surrounding Wichita, Sedgwick County area, and then just across the line south into Sumner County is our PEC monitor. You can see these are hourly values of ozone. The standard is 70 parts per billion, and we saw values, hourly values over 130. The standard for ozone, as you remember, is an 8-hour standard, and the 8-hour standard for the health department in Wichita ended up being 103 parts per billion, and the maximum 8-hour concentration at our Sedgwick monitor, which is northwest of the city of Wichita, ended up being above the standard as well at 78 parts per billion. So that's just a quick example of a potential location because of the revisions to the exceptional event rule, that the mitigation plan portion of that could affect our state and could affect other states as well, who may have wildfires or prescribed fires in their areas that may have happened in consecutive years and meet that 3 events in 3-year time frame. So with that, I think I will